First of all, I would like to thank the organizers to accept my paper. And then I would point out that I have a very awkward place here between Goodele, talking after Goodele, oh la la, and before the break, because I suppose you are all impatient to have your cup of coffee. Moreover, you will see that I am a dinosaur because I have no PowerPoint. And like in good old times, I'm going to read and ask you to concentrate on what I'm saying. So, moreover, my subject will be perceived maybe as a sort of alien. You will see why. Well, anyway. So I would like to look in detail now at an aspect of the teaching of literary translation that has not, to my knowledge, been previously discussed. Let us remember that translators do not leave their personalities in the cloakroom when they take on a translation. Among other things, their defense mechanisms, as revealed by Sigmund Freud, continue to function. Of these, the two most important in our work are repression, refoulement, Verdrängung, and sublimation, sublimation. My compatriot Tilde Barboni has written excellent articles on this subject. The following thoughts are the result of my study of the teaching of translation in relation to texts described as cultural or literary. This teaching takes place at university level, in other words, in higher education institutions, training translators and interpreters. I think it is important for me to say something about the socio-psychological aspects of my experience of teaching, which I feel have been little analyzed, and also to undo a certain conflation that is widespread in the assessment of translations. A, what is involved in teaching translation? In the first instance, teaching translation involves mobilizing a variety of faculties in the learner, both linguistic but also meta-linguistic, and setting in motion a complex process whose various elements I shall attempt to identify here. Teachers need to have a complete understanding of these processes, but such is, alas, not always the case. Observation shows that often the way in which translation classes are currently conducted still comes down to an exchange of viewpoints and impressions. It is important to say this. Yet all teaching should prioritize an element of objectivity. We all know that, primarily in the way that the teacher corrects mistakes. Objectivity of this kind is a given in the exact sciences, but is possible in other fields only if the subject being taught can be defined scientifically. Translation is not, or not yet, a science in the full meaning of the term, although for some 50 years now several research groups have been working to develop what has come to be known as translation studies or translatology. In many translation classes, it has to be said that the only arguments advanced by teachers in their corrections fall into the category of, I don't like that, and I would say rather, or I don't read it like that. Teachers who offer only intuition and adopt a subjective model for solutions represent the opposite of what a translation teacher should be. So we can begin with a critique of three approaches: intuitive responses, subjective arguments, and the imposition of models. A phenomenon frequently found in translation courses, but seldom in other disciplines, is that of aggressive reactions from students. And I suppose that that term, aggressive, is the leitmotif of my paper and is a bit original. This problem undoubtedly highlights an initial component in translation training, which is its psychological dimension. Sadly, This aspect is all too often unrecognized or ignored. Corrections provided by the teacher may target a variety of issues. 1. Poor comprehension of the original sentence, perhaps due to inadequate knowledge of the source language. Students generally react mildly to corrections reflecting this issue. They readily acknowledge that they are not sufficiently expert in the foreign language and will ask questions showing their desire to learn and progress. 2. Overall formulation in the target language. Here too, if the correction concerns an error of grammar or form, students readily admit that they were wrong. Ultimately, their only error is not having studied or read enough, which they readily acknowledge. 3. Vocabulary and style. This is where we find the aggressivity mentioned above. When the learner reacts in this way, the teacher has clearly touched a nerve. To translate well, we must of course have a near perfect knowledge of the source language, without which it is not possible to be sensitive to all the nuances of the original. But we must also, and most importantly, have an excellent command of our own mother tongue. And there, precisely, is the rub. Generally speaking, learners who translate badly also speak badly. In other words, they do not spontaneously express their thoughts well. I have noticed that in such cases, the cause is not simply a lack of lexical knowledge. Often it is about much more than that, including a kind of psychological block at the level of communicative expression. The approach adopted by most trainee translators is as follows. You all know that. They begin by reading the phrase or passage to be translated superficially, without close consideration of the details or overall thrust of the content or of the form in which it is expressed. They then immediately set about transposing the text, hoping perhaps that this will enable them to clarify things that they still find obscure. The style they adopt in doing this is not their spontaneous or habitual style, still less that of the author. Rather, it is an artificial style that they would never naturally use in speaking or writing. Their French, the target language, is either confused to the point of being almost incorrect, or else it is riddled with stylistic cliches. In short, bluntly, it is bad French or bad target language. It is precisely to combat this tracing paper approach to translation that the ESIT translation school in Paris advocated deverbalization, as Marianne Lederer and Danica Seleskovic advocated that, where deverbalizing means forgetting the words to retain only the content, the meaning. But let us be careful. This can't be any old meaning. It must be the meaning sought by the author's vision of things. This is the approach necessarily adopted by conference interpreters who must reconstruct the meaning in the most natural and quick way possible in the target language. To break students of this habit of indigestible writing, I adopt the following procedure. First, I ask them to silently read the sentence. This way, they can absorb it in their own time. Then, I ask them to hide the passage and tell me what it says. In other words, to paraphrase the content as precisely as possible, but without going back visually to the original. I always insist that they must do it in their own words. So this is not yet translating in the proper sense. What the students have to do in the first instance is to reconstruct the content without being able to look at its original wrapping. In this way, they are forced to express themselves spontaneously. Here, however, two possibilities arise. One, students usually express themselves with ease, and the semantic reconstruction in French, for instance, is already a good translation that needs to no more than a little tweaking. This way of proceeding sometimes enables students to find the best solutions, sometimes even unawares. As they have to reconstruct content rather than translate, an operation that initially seems to have an inhibiting effect, they let themselves speak and naturally find immediate, authentic, satisfactory, and indeed sometimes excellent formulations. Second case, students of this kind generally express themselves badly. Although they may have understood the meaning of the phrase perfectly well, their vocabulary is limited, vague, and bereft of nuance. Their syntax is clunky. There are two causes of this kind of failure, one psychological, the other socio-cultural. A, psychological causes. Students are shy and introverted. They have never felt the need to nuance their instrument of communication, their mother tongue, although they may have a rich inner and imaginative life. So their formulation of the content, at this stage we can't yet speak of translation, is clumsy, because from the outset and independently of the translating process, they are unable to express themselves correctly and precisely, either orally or in writing. The other possibility is that, having been subjected to an overbearing paternal authority, they find it hard to move away from the source text, which they now see as a model, since to do so would be a kind of rebellion, a rejection of the father. B, this phenomenon can also have socio-cultural causes. Students may have come from a culturally disadvantaged background. They may have grown up surrounded by people who do not read very much or express themselves well. It is students of this kind who may show the aggressive reaction I mentioned above. A negative critique of their formulation is felt to be a personal attack. In their eyes, the teacher is denying, rejecting, or disapproving of the language that is theirs, the language in which they grew up, became who they are now, and always express themselves, and in which their family and friends express themselves. This language is a profound expression of their own self and their primary immediate surroundings. In rejecting their way of expressing content, the teacher is humiliating, excluding, or marginalizing them, or at least that is how they receive the negative comments. Students of this kind may react in one of two ways. First, they may develop a real complex, adopting a disparaging view of both themselves and the background with which they identify. The teacher is obliging them to leave this background behind, if only for the space of the class, to join the ranks of those who express themselves well, and so translate better. These students develop a sense of guilt, because ultimately, what is being asked of them is to become adult by becoming independent, linguistically at least, and to turn their back on the context that has always been their own and to which they will return when the classes are over. So, through their language, it is a part of themselves that they are being made to leave behind in order to allow that language to develop and progress. Students like this usually turn inward and do not progress well. They refuse, perhaps unconsciously, to progress and so are likely to fail. They may also bear a grudge against the teacher who has disturbed their view of the world and upset their equilibrium in relation to themselves and those around them. But there is another kind of reaction. Students are hurt and wrecked with pride, which initially manifests itself in a degree of aggression. Their cheeks may flush, and they may even forget the respect they owe to their teacher. But this pride can also be very stimulating and beneficial. Injured pride incites students to break new grounds, and they make progress. Okay, second part, how can we enable learners to translate better? So it seemed to me that the first and absolutely necessary phase in teaching translation is to train students to express themselves spontaneously and correctly in their mother tongue. I would say that learning to translate means, first of all, learning to express oneself well and consequently also to think well. Translation is not a matter of thinking freely, but of following the meanderings of the author's thoughts. It is not possible here to provide the full list of all the aspects of an original text that must be taken into account in order to produce a correct rendering in the target language. I shall confine myself to mentioning the main, absolutely necessary elements that make it possible to produce a better, coherent, consistent translation. First, come the logic and consistency of the text. These are the two structuring elements of the text that usually escape the learner's reading. When authors start writing, they know where they are going. The argument and the development of their ideas or narrative are underpinned by a kind of guiding thread that is the line of their thinking and can be identified in different places. A, connectors, explicit or implicit. B, the message emphasized in each sentence. The stress is put on one message in each sentence. C, semantic fields. So before translating a text in class, we need to start by analyzing its logic, identifying the thread of the narrative or argument, as indicated by the three markers mentioned above. They are objectively identifiable components, and this objective analytical approach to the text reflects the aim I proposed at the beginning, to replace intuition and subjective correction with the precise and thus incontestable identification of mistakes. Students must first learn to read. Learning to translate must always start by learning to read in depth. Second point, then comes the subtler problem of lexical choice in the process of translating itself. If it is here that the risk, the danger of subjective arguments is most felt, and yet experience shows that there must always be a precise reason, however buried it may be, to start with, that leads a professional translator to criticize a particular lexical choice. Like doctors, translators must diagnose and identify objectively what is wrong. This is always possible and must be done in order to avoid both the fatal argument from authority, which is absolutely reprehensible, but too often used, and justification based on the supposed infallible intuition of the profession. A word may be unacceptable because it reflects in inattention to the register of the original, or a lack of attention to the type of language in which the text was written. For example, a word with emotional connotation is out of place in a descriptive text where the author's attitude towards what is being described is not relevant. Errors of tone can also be identified objectively. A poor lexical choice may give a polemical tinge to a description that was originally neutral. This leads us to the still more delicate question of connotation. It happens that some formulations regarded by the teacher as denotative are, in the eyes of students, full of connotations that they struggle to erase from memory. This connotative dimension may be classified in 4 ways: individual, personal, and therefore solely a matter of individual experience. 2, social, and thus limited connotation to one social group. 3, cultural connotation and therefore sensed by a very large group sharing the same culture. Temporal connotation, to finish, and therefore confined to a particular period of any length. There are many other reasons operating in the correction of lexical choice, which involve more subtle justifications, such as the music of the sentence. When two terms are entirely synonymous, it may be that one is better than the other for reasons of rhythm and assonance. We all know that. A word may also be chosen because its etymology makes it more expressive or evocative. And we should not forget the other crucial justification for choosing a word, which is the effect it produces. A word that has become culturally dulled and ordinary in the source language must not be translated by a powerful, seldom used word in the target language. However, this is a frequent error made by learners. To conclude this, I'm nearly finished. Yes, no, I skipped this. So now I would like briefly to come to assessment or evaluation. How can a teacher judge the overall quality of a literary translation? If such assessment always seems suspect, it is first and foremost because the thing to be assessed relates to art and thus relates also to art and thus to subjectivity. It seems to me that in assessing a translation, we must distinguish between two levels, one objective and the other subjective. First, the objective level covers all the errors that are, for a wide variety of reasons, scientifically identifiable. The main types are as follows: lexical errors, error of interpretation, failure to respect the force of the word, inappropriate connotation, insufficient attention to polyphony and ambiguity, so important in an author's text, the polyphony. Then syntactical errors, shift in the emphasis of the message. I shift the stress. Stylistic errors, lack of awareness of semantic fields. And last, errors of consistency in relation to the logical consistency of the text, in relation to the rhythmic and melodic consistency of the text. All these errors can be objectively identified and corrected. This said, there is a threshold above which assessment becomes inseparable from subjective opinion, when two translations that respect all the rules of transposition mentioned above are extremely different. In such cases, clearly, the difference between the two target texts is due to different readings of the original. It is here that the assessment moves into an entirely subjective area, depending on the degree to which the reading reflected in one or other of the translations corresponds more to the corrector's own. At this point, the assessment becomes a matter of taste. I think that the difficulty of assessing literary translation resides entirely in the very occasional crossing of this threshold between a simple error that can be easily identified and measured and a version that is in itself correct, but different from what the assessor would have written or finds pleasing. My conclusion, literary translation is first and foremost a reading. In other words, a reception of meaning. A person will read the same text in different ways at different ages and even at different times of the day. Even when it has been reconstructed in a way that is objectively correct, it remains the case that any transposition passes through the prism of the translator's experience and personality. So, two excellent translations that are objectively correct may be assessed differently depending on the reader's affinity with the translator's version. But it is solely at this point that assessment becomes a matter of taste and can be called subjective. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Françoise. I was reminded in, sorry, a rustle of applause in the room. I was reminded of Anna Stroh's response to our Yazi colleagues' presentation earlier, and her remarking that perhaps it comes down to our student translators needing to read more. And you were highlighting psychological reasons and sociocultural causes. And I wonder whether in a way, the first principle to stress with students, and what was coming out of your presentation, is the need simply to read more and to read as widely as possible in their native language.
Yes, but to read well, which is not obvious. Yeah.
So perhaps yes. What is needed is teaching, as you said. Translators need to first to learn to read, and perhaps we need more classes that specifically focus on that. I don't know, do we have, I'm wondering to what extent reading is reflected in the framework. I haven't checked recently, but that's something.
Yes, it is. Yeah, yes.
That's something perhaps to check in the
textual analysis. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any other responses to Françoise's presentation? Here's one. Thank you, Natalia. Do you think machine translation can become a good solution to standardized translations that were translated by translators' poor linguistic background? So might machine translation then be a kind of solution to the problems that you are isolating?
Are you asking me?
That's a question for you, yes.
Yes. How shall I put it? I think that machine translation will be acceptable when the tool, the digital tool, will be similar to our brains. Because when I have to translate, for instance, someone like Stefan Zweig, I retranslated his short stories. And when I see the time I spent to find the exact meaning of one word, and understand suddenly that that particular word is referring like a sun to a variety of connotations and allusions, I doubt that ever a machine will be able to understand that. So one day I put a passage of Stefan Zweig on a machine translation tool, and the result was so ridiculous. I mean, no, maybe a machine will be able to translate like we translators do, but then that will be the recreation of a brain. That's all. Yeah. No, because a machine doesn't have a context, has no style. And a translator has a style, even if he tries to avoid his style. A lot of people say that they recognize me in my translations, which I don't like that. I don't like when they say that, because I want to disappear. But well, my way of finding solutions is my way. You see, you will find another solution. So I don't know if I have answered the question, but this is what I think anyway. But I'm a dinosaur, as I said at the beginning. Yes.
Thank you, Françoise. No, certainly. I think that was actually, I think having heard you on this topic before, I think that was admirably restrained as a response to a question like that. I know I think perhaps the question was prompted by your focusing on objectivity and the idea that perhaps then machine translation can provide, I mean, clearly can provide a kind of objectivity, perhaps the kind that you are looking to strengthen. But
yes, you are right in the assessment. I agree, but okay. Only in the assessment, not in, because there is a part in translation which we call clumsily maybe, creativity. When will a machine be creative? Well, maybe one day. I will not be of this world anymore.
I think there are some, and some at this conference, who would argue that machines are, in some senses, already there. But that's a big discussion, and it's going to perhaps be taking place in different strands as well. But for the moment, we, I think, need to draw this group of presentations to a close. Thank you once again, Françoise.
Thanks to you.
Such a spirited presentation, and that was really very thought-provoking and in some ways deliberately provocative. I think you've given us plenty to take us on through the rest of today and indeed tomorrow. So Françoise, thank you.